I learned too late that silence isn't something your family forgives. They'll forgive debt. They'll forgive addiction. They'll forgive the cousin who ruins every Thanksgiving. But silence, the kind that means you can't explain where you were, what you did, or why you missed the funeral by 9 hours, that they'll hold against you until they find a way to make it hurt. My sister found a way. My name is Elise Rourke. I'm 42 years old. And 3 weeks ago, my older sister Margot stood in front of 200 university alumni at a homecoming banquet, tapped her manicured nail against her phone screen, and announced to the table, loud enough for the tables on either side to hear, that I'd been let go from the State Department for incompetence, that I couldn't even hold down a desk job. The woman being honored that night, the one walking to the podium to accept a Distinguished Alumni Service Award, had extracted me from a blown safe house in Chisinau, Moldova. She'd carried me through a service corridor with my right arm hanging at an angle. Arms aren't supposed to hang. She'd put me in an embassy vehicle and told the driver to skip every red light between there and the airport. Margot didn't know that. She didn't know any of it. But I need to go back before I go forward. Because what happened at that banquet didn't start that night. It started 17 years ago, when I took an oath in a windowless room on the 4th floor of a building in Northern Virginia. No cameras, no ceremony. Just a laminated card, a signature, and a woman behind a desk who said, "Welcome aboard. Tell your family you work in consular affairs." So I did. I spent 17 years with the Central Intelligence Agency, clandestine service. My official cover was a mid-level position with the State Department. Visa processing, consular support, the kind of job that makes people's eyes glaze over at dinner parties. That was the point. You want a cover story so boring that nobody asks a follow-up question. For 3 of those 17 years, I ran a network of sources inside a corrupt Eastern European government. Assets I recruited. Meetings I planned in dead drops and rented apartments that smelled like boiled cabbage and radiator dust. Reports I filed in a cipher-locked room the size of a closet, where the only sound was the hum of a server rack and my own breathing. That network produced intelligence that led to the interdiction of a uranium enrichment supply chain. Not theoretical, not aspirational. Components that were 60 days from delivery to a state that should never have had them. My sources, people who risked everything on my word that I would protect them, made that interdiction possible. I can't tell you their names. I won't tell you the country. What I can tell you is that the operation ended badly for me. In the final months, a source was compromised. The network started to collapse inward like a building losing its load-bearing walls, 1 floor at a time. I was in Chisinau, Moldova, running the exfiltration of my last remaining asset, when local security services picked me up outside a cafe on Strada Bucharest. No warrant. No charges. Just 2 men in leather jackets and a van with tinted windows. They held me for 11 hours in a basement that smelled like wet concrete and old cigarettes. The overhead light was a single bulb behind a wire cage. The chair was bolted to the floor. During the interrogation, one of them wrenched my right arm behind my back and upward until the shoulder dislocated. I heard it before I felt it. A deep, wet pop, like a knuckle cracking inside a wet towel. Then the pain arrived. White. Total. The kind that empties your skull of everything except the need for it to stop. I didn't give them anything. Not because I'm brave. Because there was nothing to give that wouldn't have gotten people killed. The station chief, a woman named Helen Vickers, officially the deputy chief of mission at the embassy, negotiated my release through channels I still can't discuss. She came for me herself. When they brought me out of that basement, my right arm was hanging wrong. Vickers took one look, gripped my wrist without asking, and reset the shoulder in the back seat of an embassy sedan. She'd done it before. Not to me. She knew the motion. The reset wasn't clean. Field conditions. No imaging. No proper stabilization afterward. The shoulder healed with a permanent anterior subluxation. What that means in plain language is that the ball of the joint doesn't sit in the socket correctly anymore. It shifts. It clicks. When I reach overhead, for a coffee mug on a high shelf, for a carry-on in an overhead bin, the joint slides forward with a soft, wet sound that makes anyone standing close enough wince. I've learned to mask it, a subtle roll of the shoulder backward, locking the joint into place before anyone notices. I do it dozens of times a day. It looks like a stretch. It's not. That shoulder is the only evidence of what happened in Chisinau that I carry on the outside. Now, my father, Arthur Rourke, retired Foreign Service officer. He spent 31 years in embassies across 4 continents. He understood the clandestine world the way only someone adjacent to it can. He knew the rhythms, the absences, the careful non-answers that mean something is classified. He never asked me what I did. Not once. Not because he didn't care. Because he knew that asking would put me in the position of lying to him. And he loved me enough not to do that. He died 14 months ago. Pancreatic cancer. Fast. 6 weeks from diagnosis to funeral. I was in a country I can't name when I got the notification through a secure channel. I requested emergency leave. It was denied. Operational necessity. I sat in a rented apartment 4,000 miles away and stared at a wall while my father was buried in Arlington. I made it back 9 hours after the service. I stood at his grave alone. The grass hadn't settled yet. The flowers were already wilting in the August heat. I stayed for 40 minutes. Nobody else was there. He died lonely. I know that. Margot isn't entirely wrong about the disappearing. My cover required absences that looked like neglect, missed holidays that looked like indifference, calls I couldn't return for days that looked like I didn't care. I let him believe a version of me that wasn't true because the alternative, telling him the truth, would have violated an oath I swore in that windowless room when I was 25 years old. He understood. I believe that. But understanding doesn't keep your hand warm at 2 a.m. in a hospital room when your daughter is somewhere she can't name, doing something she can't explain. I lost time with my father that I will never get back. That's the cost. I chose the oath. I'd choose it again, but I don't pretend it was free. After he died, he left me a leather passport wallet. Old. Soft. The kind of leather that remembers the shape of your pocket. Inside were stamps from every country where he'd served. 23 of them, some from nations that don't exist under those names anymore. Tucked behind the stamps was a note in his handwriting, small and precise. The ones who can't talk about what they did are the ones who did the most. I keep that wallet in my bedside drawer. Some mornings, I open it just to smell the leather. It smells like his study, like pipe tobacco and old paper and the particular stillness of a man who knew how to wait. 3 months ago, on a Tuesday morning in my apartment in D.C., I reached for a coffee mug on the second shelf. The shoulder slipped. That wet click. The mug stayed where it was. I stood in my kitchen with my arm pressed against my side, breathing through my teeth, waiting for the joint to slide back. It took almost a full minute. I ate breakfast with my left hand. Cereal. No milk because the carton was on the top shelf of the refrigerator, and I wasn't reaching for anything else that morning. If this is landing somewhere, if you know what it is to carry a cost that doesn't show up anywhere anyone can see, stay with me. Subscribe if you haven't. This story isn't over yet. Nobody saw, nobody called, nobody knew. That's the part Margot never understood. Not the classified work, not the operations. Just the ordinary way a life like mine is lived. Quietly, alone, with pain you've learned to manage so well that the people closest to you forget it exists. But Margot didn't forget me. She just built a different version. It started 2 months after the funeral. First came the family group chat. I wasn't removed. That would have been too obvious. Margot's husband, Thomas Haynes, simply created a new one. Same family members, same thread of holiday plans and recipe links, and photos of my nephew's soccer games. I just wasn't in it. I found out when my cousin mentioned a Thanksgiving gathering I hadn't been invited to. Margot said you were traveling again, she said. She said you probably wouldn't want to come. I wasn't traveling. I was home, 8 miles away. Then the photos. Every picture of me from our father's funeral, the few that existed since I'd arrived after the service, was untagged from the family accounts. Not deleted. Untagged. So my face was still there if you looked closely, but my name was severed from it. Thomas did that. I know because Margot doesn't manage her own social media. She dictates. He executes. Then the narrative. Margot began telling our father's former colleagues, retired diplomats, State Department alumni, people who'd known our family for decades, that I had been disciplined for mishandling sensitive documents, that I'd been put on administrative leave, that the State Department had quietly let me go. None of this was true, but Margot understood something about repetition. If you say it enough times, to enough people, leaning across enough dinner tables over enough glasses of Pinot Grigio, it stops being gossip and starts being fact. I heard about it from a retired ambassador's wife who called me to express her sympathy. Margot mentioned your situation, she said. Her voice had that careful softness people use when they think you're fragile. She's just so worried about you. I thanked her for calling. I didn't correct the record. I couldn't. What was I supposed to say? Actually, I'm a clandestine service officer with the CIA and my sister is lying. The cover that protected me from foreign intelligence services also protected Margot's version of events. She could say anything, and I could say nothing. Then she escalated beyond gossip. 6 weeks ago, Margot filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the State Department's Public Affairs Office requesting my personnel file. She used our shared last name and our father's career as leverage to frame it as a family matter. She thought she'd find a termination record, a disciplinary action, something she could hold up and say, "See, I was right." What she actually triggered was a security review. When a FOIA request targets a cover identity attached to a clandestine officer, it doesn't go to public affairs. It goes to the security directorate. Red flags. Internal audits. People in windowless rooms asking questions about whether my cover has been compromised and whether my sister's inquiry represents a hostile probing action or simply a family dispute. I was pulled into a 4-hour debrief. I sat across from 2 counterintelligence officers who needed to determine whether Margot was acting alone or had been manipulated by a foreign service. I had to explain my own family to people who assess threats for a living. I had to sit in a room that smelled like recycled air and vending machine coffee and describe how my sister resented me for missing our father's funeral. They concluded she was acting alone. A domestic grievance, not a security breach. But the incident is in my file now, permanently. Margot doesn't know she did that. She thinks she filed a simple records request. She doesn't know she nearly triggered a formal damage assessment. And then came the letter. Mr. Caldwell has been my landlord for 6 years. A quiet man in his 70s who lives downstairs and waters the front garden every morning at 7. He cashed my rent checks for 72 consecutive months without once being late. He's never had a reason to doubt me until he received a typed letter on what appeared to be official university stationery, signed with a name he didn't recognize, but carrying enough institutional weight to feel legitimate. The letter stated that I was unemployed, that I had been terminated from federal service, that my financial situation was precarious, and that he should take appropriate steps to protect his property. Margot forged that letter. She used the University Development Office letterhead, her own department, and fabricated a reference to a concerned family member outreach that doesn't exist in any university policy. Mr. Caldwell taped a 3-day eviction notice to my door on a Wednesday morning. I came home from a briefing, one I can't describe, and found it stuck to the paint with blue masking tape. 3 days, after 6 years. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 14 minutes before I went inside. I didn't cry. I pressed my thumb into the scar tissue on the front of my right shoulder, the spot where the joint pushes forward when it subluxates, and I held it there until the pressure was the only thing I could feel. Then I went inside and called a lawyer. What happens next is the reason I'm telling you this story. 3 weeks ago, Margot hosted the university's annual alumni homecoming banquet. 200 guests, donor tables, a live jazz quartet. Margot in a navy silk dress, greeting every arrival by title alone. Dean Parker, glad you could join us. Dr. Whitfield, the development committee is grateful, because Margot introduces people the way she organizes seating charts, by rank. She'd sent me an invitation. I almost didn't go. But the program listed the evening's honoree for the Distinguished Alumni Service Award, and when I read the name, I went still. Helen Vickers, the woman who pulled me out of Chisinau, the woman who reset my shoulder in the back of an embassy car, the woman who sat with me on a military transport, while I shook so hard my teeth chattered and never once told me it was going to be okay, because she respected me enough not to lie. Helen Vickers was standing at the podium of my sister's banquet, and my sister had no idea who she really was. I arrived at 7:15. The banquet hall was on the 3rd floor of the Alumni Center, a renovated brick building that still smelled faintly of the library it used to be. Old wood polish and carpet cleaner, and the particular staleness of rooms that get opened 4 times a year. The jazz quartet was playing something soft near the windows. 200 chairs, white tablecloths, candles in glass votives casting that warm amber light that makes everyone look successful. Margot saw me from across the room. I watched her register my presence the way you register a coat check. Something to manage, not someone to greet. She finished her conversation with a silver-haired man in a charcoal suit, touched his arm, laughed at something he said, then walked toward me. She was carrying a champagne flute. She hadn't drunk from it. It was a prop. Elise. She looked at my dress, Black. Tailored. The kind of thing you put on when you intend to be underestimated and still look like you could take the room. I wasn't sure you'd come. You sent the invitation. I sent a lot of invitations. She half-turned toward the nearest donor table. You're at table 14, near the back. I didn't want to put you somewhere you'd feel. She paused, uncomfortable. Table 14 was the farthest table from the stage. I'd seen the seating chart posted on an easel by the entrance. The tables near the front were labeled with names I recognized from donor lists. Table 14 was labeled Additional Guests. I didn't argue. I walked to the back of the room and sat down. The chair was the same as every other chair. The tablecloth was the same white linen, but table 14 had 6 seats instead of 8, and 2 of them were empty. The centerpiece was smaller. No place cards. The back of the room, where the sound from the quartet went muddy, and the catering staff walked past with trays they didn't bother to offer. Margot had put me where she put everything she didn't want donors to see. I straightened my napkin. I set my clutch on the table. Inside it, in the zippered pocket against the lining, was my father's passport wallet. I'd brought it without deciding to. That morning, I'd been standing at my dresser, and my hand went to the drawer, and I put it in my bag the way you pick up your keys. Automatic. Necessary. The people at my table were polite. A retired English professor named Dr. Ellis and his wife. A young alumni coordinator who kept checking her phone. A man named Porter who worked in campus facilities and seemed surprised to be invited at all. Dr. Ellis asked what I did. I told him I worked for the State Department. He nodded. His wife asked if I'd traveled much. I said yes. She asked where. I said I couldn't always say. She smiled. My brother was Army intelligence. Same answer every Thanksgiving. I liked her. I didn't tell her that. At 7:45, Margot took the microphone. She welcomed the room. She thanked the donors. She listed the new buildings, the endowed chairs, the scholarship initiatives. Each one attached to a name. Each name attached to a giving level. Each giving level climbing toward the kind of number that gets your portrait in a hallway. Margot was good at this. She understood the architecture of flattery. She built it like a staircase, each step designed to make the person on it feel like they were the highest point in the room. Then she began introducing the honoree. Our Distinguished Alumni Service Award recognizes a career of extraordinary public service. This year's recipient served for over 3 decades as a diplomat and senior foreign service officer, most recently as Deputy Chief of Mission in several of our nation's most challenging postings. Deputy Chief of Mission. That was Helen's cover. The official version. The version that was true on paper and incomplete in every way that mattered. She has received multiple State Department commendations and is widely regarded as one of the finest leaders our Foreign Service has ever produced. Margot said this with the smooth certainty of someone reading from a bio she hadn't written and didn't question. She didn't know that Helen Vickers had been a CIA station chief who ran clandestine operations across 3 continents. She didn't know that the diplomatic postings included overseeing intelligence networks in countries where being identified meant being killed. She didn't know that the woman she was about to hand a crystal plaque had once carried me, physically carried me, through a service corridor with my shoulder dislocated and blood on her blouse from where my forehead had split against a concrete wall. Margot knew none of this. She knew the plaque was heavy and the donor who sponsored the award expected a photo. Helen Vickers took the stage. She looked exactly the way I remembered, except older in the way that strong people age. The lines deeper, the posture unchanged. Gray hair cut short, a dark green dress with a simple gold brooch on the lapel. She wore no rings, her hands were steady. She gripped the sides of the podium the way she'd once gripped the steering wheel of an embassy vehicle doing 60 through Chisinau. Firm, unhurried, in absolute control. She gave her speech. 5 minutes. Measured. She talked about service without naming specifics, about the people who worked in silence, about the cost of careers that couldn't be discussed at dinner tables. She spoke the way people in our world speak publicly, every word chosen for what it doesn't reveal. I sat at table 14 and listened. My shoulder clicked once, softly, when I shifted in my chair. I rolled it back, locked it. Nobody noticed. Then Margot stood. She took the microphone back, and she did something I should have expected but didn't. She introduced me, not to the room, to the table of donors seated beside her. Table 2, front and center. 8 people with last names on buildings. That's my sister Elise back there. She gestured toward table 14 with her champagne flute. She was with the State Department for a while. Consular section. She paused. Let it settle. Unfortunately, she was let go. Couldn't quite manage the workload. A small, sympathetic smile. The kind that performs concern while delivering a verdict. We're hoping she lands on her feet. 8 faces at table 2 turned to look at me. Polite. Pitying. The way you look at someone's struggling relative at a party. Dr. Ellis's wife touched my wrist under the table. A small gesture. She'd heard. I felt the shoulder shift, the soft, wet click, the ball of the joint sliding forward a 1/4 inch against the socket rim. I breathed through it. I placed both hands flat on the tablecloth. I rolled the shoulder backward. Slow. Controlled. The joint seated itself with a sound only I could hear. Then I picked up my water glass with my left hand and took a sip. Some roles don't translate well, I said. To no one in particular. To everyone at table 14. My voice was level. 7 words. Dr. Ellis's wife squeezed my wrist and let go. Margot had already turned away. She was done with me. I was managed, filed, put in my place at table 14 where the sound went muddy and the trays didn't stop. What she didn't see, what none of them saw, was Helen Vickers standing at the edge of the stage, her speech finished, her crystal plaque in one hand. She wasn't looking at Margot. She wasn't looking at the donors. She was looking at me. I didn't see it happen. Dr. Ellis's wife told me later that Vickers handed the plaque to a university staffer, said something brief, and stepped down from the stage without returning to her assigned seat at table 1. She crossed the room. Not fast, not slow. The particular walk of a woman who has entered rooms far more dangerous than this one and never once adjusted her pace for the people in them. She walked past table 1, past tables 2 through 13, straight to 14. The first thing I felt was her hand. Not on my arm, not on my good shoulder, on my right shoulder. The bad one. She placed it there and pressed down, firm, precise, exactly the way a field medic stabilizes a joint they've reduced before. The exact pressure, the exact position. My shoulder didn't click. She knew where to hold it so it wouldn't. The room didn't understand the gesture. I did. 17 years of cover. 17 years of a life I couldn't explain. And this woman's hand on my shoulder said, I know exactly who you are. I know exactly what that shoulder cost you. I was there. She leaned down, close enough that only I could hear. Last time I held this shoulder, you were shaking so hard I thought you'd crack a tooth. She paused. What was the name of the driver? The one who ran every red light. My throat tightened. Doru. Doru. She said the name like a password, because it was. No debrief form, no personnel file, no FOIA request would ever produce that name. It existed only in the memory of the people who were in that car. Then Helen Vickers straightened. She turned to face the table. Then she turned farther, toward Margot, who had noticed the room's attention shifting and was walking toward us with the confused expression of someone whose seating chart had been violated. I'm sorry, Margot said, arriving at table 14 with her professional smile already deployed. Mrs. Vickers, we have you seated at table 1. Can I? You can sit down, Vickers said. Margot blinked. Vickers reached into the leather folio she'd been carrying all evening, the one the audience assumed held her speech notes. She withdrew a sealed envelope. Ivory. Heavy stock. The kind of paper that carries institutional weight before you read a word. On the front, pressed into the paper in gold, the federal seal. She placed it on the table, squarely, centered between the votive candle and Margot's abandoned champagne flute. This is a declassified citation, Vickers said. Not loud. She didn't need to be. The room had already gone quiet the way rooms go quiet when authority walks to the wrong table. Not silence, but the jazz quartet finishing a phrase and not starting another. Conversations trailing off mid-sentence, forks pausing above plates. A meritorious honor award. The details inside remain partially redacted for national security reasons, but the summary is unclassified as of last month, and it names the recipient. She looked at Margot. Your sister. Margot's lips parted. No sound. The woman you just described to this room as someone who couldn't manage a workload, Vickers continued, ran a clandestine intelligence operation in one of the most hostile environments on this planet. She recruited and managed a network of sources who provided intelligence that directly prevented weapons-grade nuclear material from reaching a hostile state. She did this for 3 years, alone, undercover, without the ability to tell a single person in her family what she was doing or why she was gone. Margot's hand found the back of a chair, her manicured nails pressed into the upholstery. During the final phase of that operation, she was detained by a foreign security service. She was interrogated for 11 hours. She gave them nothing. She protected every source, every asset, every piece of intelligence, at extraordinary personal cost. Vickers's hand was still on my shoulder. She hadn't moved it. I know this because I was the one who got her out. I was the one who reset the shoulder they dislocated. And I was the one who sat with her on the transport afterward while she held that arm against her chest and didn't make a sound. The room was silent now. Not the trailing off kind. True silence. The jazz quartet had stopped entirely. 200 people were looking at table 14. Margot's face had gone white. Not red. White. The blood draining from a woman who had built an entire narrative, months of careful phone calls and fabricated letters, and FOIA requests and blue masking tape on my door, and was watching it collapse in real time under the weight of an ivory envelope and a federal seal. You introduced your sister to this room as a failure, Vickers said. Her voice carried the way voices carry when they don't need to be raised. I'm introducing her as one of the most courageous officers I have ever had the privilege of serving with, and I have served with many. Margot opened her mouth. I didn't. She stopped. She looked at me. For the first time all evening, maybe for the first time in years, she actually looked at me. Not at the version, not at the narrative, at me. I didn't look away. I didn't stand. I didn't reach for the envelope. I said one thing. You never asked, Margot. My voice was steady, quiet, the same volume I'd used to order coffee. You had 17 years to ask me one real question about my life. You never did. You just decided. Her hand slipped off the chair back. She caught it. She pressed it flat against her stomach like she was trying to hold something in. Thomas was standing 6 feet behind her. I could see him over her shoulder. His face had the particular expression of a man who has just realized that every task his wife asked him to perform, the new group chat, the untagged photos, the digital architecture of erasure, was built on a lie she told him first. He didn't move. He didn't speak. Margot looked at the envelope on the table. At Vickers. At me. I didn't know, she said. Her voice came out small, the sound of a person whose architecture has just given way. Vickers removed her hand from my shoulder. Slowly. The joint held. No, Vickers said. You didn't. But you didn't not know because the information wasn't available. You didn't know because you never considered the possibility that your sister might be more than the story you told about her. The room stayed quiet for a long time after that. The kind of quiet that reorganizes things. Not just the air in the room, the people in it, where they stand, who they look at. Margot left the banquet 11 minutes after Vickers finished speaking. Thomas drove. She didn't say goodbye to the donors. She didn't close the event. The university's associate provost took the microphone at 8:45 and thanked everyone for coming with the clipped efficiency of someone doing damage control in real time. I stayed at table 14. Dr. Ellis's wife brought me a cup of tea from the catering station. I didn't drink it. I held it with both hands and let the heat move through my palms. Vickers sat beside me for 20 minutes. We didn't talk about the speech. We didn't talk about Margot. She asked me if I'd been sleeping. I told her most nights. She nodded. She knew what most nights meant. Before she left, she tapped the ivory envelope with one finger. Read it when you're alone, she said. Not tonight. I put it in my clutch, next to the passport wallet. Then I drove home. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They came the way consequences come in real life, through phone calls, letters, secondhand reports, and the slow withdrawal of people who don't want to be associated with the person who's falling. The first domino was the FOIA request. Margot had filed it 6 weeks earlier, targeting what she believed was my personnel record at the State Department. When a FOIA request hits a cover identity attached to an active clandestine officer, it triggers a security review. I'd already sat through my debrief. What I didn't know, what I learned from my attorney 3 days after the banquet, was that the Security Directorate had referred the request to the Inspector General's office, not as a routine flag, as a referral for potential malicious harassment of a federal employee. The IG's office pulled Margot's submission. They pulled her follow-up emails, 4 of them, each more insistent than the last. They pulled the metadata that showed she'd used her university email address and her university office IP address to file a federal records request as part of what investigators characterized as a sustained personal campaign to damage the reputation and employment status of a family member. That language, sustained personal campaign, appeared in the IG's preliminary findings. My attorney received a copy because I was the named subject of the request. He read it to me over the phone while I sat at my kitchen table with a pen I never used. The IG didn't file criminal charges. They don't, usually, for a first referral involving a civilian. But the finding was forwarded to the university's Office of General Counsel, with a recommendation that the institution review whether its resources, email, IP address, letterhead, had been used in the commission of a federal harassment action. That review started 11 days after the banquet. I know this because my attorney told me. He heard it from the university's outside counsel during a discovery call related to what came next. The letter. The forged letter to Mr. Caldwell. My attorney had already pulled the original from Mr. Caldwell, who'd kept it in a kitchen drawer because he wasn't sure what to do with it. The letter was typed on University Development Office letterhead. It carried a fabricated reference number. It cited a concerned family member outreach protocol that does not exist in any university policy manual. And it stated that I was unemployed, terminated from federal service, and financially unstable, none of which was true. My attorney filed a civil countersuit against Margot Rourke Haynes for defamation and fraud. The defamation claim was based on the letter's false statements about my employment. The fraud claim was based on the use of fabricated university letterhead and a non-existent institutional protocol to create the appearance of official communication. Margot retained counsel. Her attorney reviewed the letter, the IG referral, the metadata from the FOIA emails, and the preliminary findings from the university's internal review. 13 days after the banquet, Margot's attorney contacted mine to discuss settlement. The sanctions totaled $115,000, $65,000 in compensatory damages for the defamation, the eviction notice, the disruption to my housing, the reputational harm with a landlord of 6 years. $30,000 in punitive damages reflecting the deliberate fabrication of institutional correspondence. $20,000 in legal fees. Margot paid it from savings. I know this because my attorney's paralegal processed the wire transfer and noted it came from a personal account, not an institutional one. The university did not indemnify her. They couldn't. She'd used their letterhead without authorization to commit fraud. Indemnifying her would have been an admission that the university sanctioned the action. The university completed its internal review 3 weeks after the banquet. Margot was not fired. She was given the option to resign. The distinction matters only on paper. When a development director at a university that depends on donor relationships becomes the subject of a federal IG referral and a 6-figure civil judgment, the distinction between resigned and terminated is the difference between a quiet exit and a loud one. Margot chose the quiet exit. She cleared her office on a Thursday. I know because my cousin, the same cousin who'd told me about the Thanksgiving gathering I wasn't invited to, called me that evening. She said Margot had told her she was taking time to focus on personal priorities. She said Thomas had answered the door when she stopped by the house and looked like he hadn't slept in a week. I didn't call. I didn't drive over. I didn't send a card. The retired ambassador's wife, the one who'd called me months earlier to express sympathy for my situation, called again. This time her voice didn't have that careful softness. It was clipped, embarrassed. She said Margot had told her I'd been disciplined for mishandling sensitive documents. She said she'd repeated that to at least 3 other people. She said she was sorry. You believed what she told you, I said. Most people did. I should have called you first. She was right. She should have. I didn't tell her that. The circles Margot had cultivated, the Foreign Service alumni network, the university donor community, the social infrastructure she'd built her professional identity inside, contracted around her the way a hand closes, not all at once, gradually. The invitations that stopped arriving, the calls that went to voicemail, the annual holiday party at the retired ambassador's residence where her name was simply absent from the list. Not crossed out, just not there. The way my name had been absent from the group chat. The way my face had been untagged from the photos. The architecture of erasure she'd built for me rebuilt itself around her, without anyone planning it, without anyone making a speech. Just the quiet, organic withdrawal of people who now associated her name with a lie. Thomas texted me 6 weeks after the banquet. One message. Elise, I know I don't deserve a response. I did things I shouldn't have done. I didn't ask enough questions. Can I see you sometime? Not for a holiday, just sometime. I read it 3 times. I set the phone down on the kitchen counter. I opened the refrigerator. I reached for the milk on the top shelf. My shoulder clicked. I let it. I stood there with my arm extended, the joint shifting in its socket, and I held the position for 5 seconds because I wanted to feel it. The cost. The proof. Then I put the milk on the counter and picked up my phone. I left Thomas on red. Not because I'll never answer, because I'm not ready to decide yet. And nobody gets to rush that. Not anymore. Last Tuesday, I drove to my father's house. Margot had listed it with a realtor 2 months after the funeral, but it hadn't sold. The market was soft and the house was old. A colonial in Falls Church with a leaking sunroom and a furnace that made sounds like a man clearing his throat. The realtor's lockbox was on the front door. I had a key from before. The study was the same. His desk, his bookshelves, the leather chair with the permanent impression of a man who sat in it for 30 years reading cables he'd never discuss. The room smelled like pipe tobacco and old paper and dust. And underneath all of it, the faintest trace of the cedar blocks he kept in the closet to protect his dress uniforms. I sat in his chair. I opened my clutch and took out the passport wallet. The leather was soft under my thumb. 23 stamps from countries he'd served in, some of them faded beyond recognition. I turned past the stamps slowly, the way you turn pages in a book you've memorized, but still need to hold. Then I took out the ivory envelope. I broke the seal. Inside was the citation, my name, partially redacted, with language I'd never seen formalized. Words like extraordinary valor and significant contribution to national security printed on heavy stock with the federal seal embossed at the top. I read it once. I set it on his desk. Then I slid his note out of the passport wallet. That small, precise handwriting. The ones who can't talk about what they did are the ones who did the most. I placed the note on top of the citation. They fit together. His words over the government's words. The personal over the institutional. The father who understood over the system that classified. My shoulder clicked once, softly, as I leaned back in his chair. I didn't roll it. I didn't lock the joint. I let it sit where it wanted. The study was quiet. October light through the window. Dust in the air catching the last of the afternoon sun. For the first time in 17 years, I didn't need anyone to know. The people who mattered already did. If this story found you tonight, if you've ever done the hardest work of your life in silence and watched someone else explain you to the world, I'd like to ask you something. What did your silence cost? Not what it protected. What it cost. There's a difference, and most people never get asked. Leave it in the comments if you want, or just sit with it. Either way, I'm glad you stayed. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's a good time. Hit the bell too. I've got more stories like this one. People who carried what they couldn't explain and found out the truth has its own schedule. I think you'll want to hear them.